away you go.
Okay, despite us using Teams, I'm now struggling with it for some reason to get my PowerPoint up. Just a moment. What I will do, I will start talking whilst I'm fiddling around with PowerPoint because the slides don't matter straight away. In 2014, I was one of the keynote speakers at what I think was the first academic conference on folk horror, and I observed there that folk horror could not simply refer, not that people are saying this is simple, to narratives which had a basis in folk tales, because then all vampire and werewolf and zombie stories would be folk horror. Since then, many people have made a similar observation, but it is a fairly obvious point. Instead, I suggested that it's more helpful to think about folk horror in terms of horror that is related to the folk, that is, to the people of the typically rural community that it features. We've already had some of this. More particularly, we can think about folk horror as related to the usage of the idea of the folk in notions of collectors of folk song, story, and practice, who imagined a particularly rural community that were tight-knit and who had inhabited a specific place since time immemorial, and who somehow preserved the old songs and stories and ways in a largely unchanged form. Of course, to do so meant being lacking in outside influences, including formal education. This paper then explores this concept very briefly, picking at some implications. This will primarily focus on issues of identity and power, which seem to me to be central to folk horror. Again, we've had some of that already. I argue that the uncomfortable disruptions caused by folk horror are in the way that it can be seen to challenge power relationships, shifting knowledge and understanding of the real workings of the universe from the cities and the educated metropolitan classes to the rural working class. That even when a folk horror film like The Wicker Man shows an aristocrat using ideas of folk beliefs in an attempt to control the people are ultimately the ones who gain power from those beliefs. This power is based in tradition, whether real or fake, and connection to place, and so assumed connection to the deeper origins of a local identity. This connection in turn gives power to the local community by giving and enhancing a sense of shared identity, which can readily then be linked to wider ideas of national identity. Folk horror can thus be easily understood as a conservative horror genre, in that the horror is the horror of ordinary people, people who are rural and perhaps uneducated, lacking in metropolitan graces. But it is also a horror of a conservative community, one that is unchanging and in which everyone knows their place. So I return to another idea that I first raised over 7 years ago. Folk horror is a horror of ambiguity, one that tempts from multiple angles and appeals in different ways to different tastes. I do want to emphasize that I am not proposing this as the sole definition of folk horror. I tend to follow Jason Mittel's idea of genres as cultural categories, where what is interesting and important is not claiming the authority to set the definition that everyone should abide by, but rather exploring how people and groups use genre labels. What I am doing here is picking up part of the term used to describe a genre and some of the ideas that are associated with it in order to consider what they might mean for the genre and for how people engage with it and the meaning they can derive from it. I'm certainly not claiming that this consideration of the folk must be a defining feature of all folk horror products, but it is a way of thinking about at least some. So, Paul Cowdell has similarly drawn a contrast between folk horror and the previously dominant Gothic paradigm to argue that, there we go, the superstitious peasantry in all their muddy reality move from background to center stage in folk horror. They become less plot adjuncts than the defining milieu. Folk horror films are predicated on more complete visions of socio-economic worlds within a time and space than Gothic horror. Farming is an actual practice in folk horror, rather than a pretextual backdrop. This picks up on the way that Piers Haggard described his film Blood on Satan's Claw as folk horror in 2003, emphasizing its focus on the community as a way of differentiating the film, particularly from that dominant Gothic strain. And what Cowdell's point about farming being an actual practice in folk horror emphasizes is the connection of the community in folk horror to land, back to the landscape. And it is community which is central to this idea of the folk, and so of folk horror, for me. This stems from the concerns about the loss of community with the development of modernity and the disruption of traditional life brought on by the scattering of communities in the wake of industrialization. It is, of course, a highly romanticized vision of a rural idyll. Everyone had a place, and they were all tied together in service of the community, which in turn was connected to a particular location that had been occupied since time immemorial. This romantic, fanciful idea would have the local community developing in harmony with the land, something that is both practical, such as in selecting which crops suit the soil and what kind of building materials are available, and also could be seen in a more spiritual or supernatural way. There is, of course, some truth to this, and Nicholas Crane's book, The Making of the British Landscape, provides ample examples of how local landscape is shaped by human activity, while human activity is also shaped by the specifics of the local landscape. However, the idea that these relationships are unchanging is clearly not true, just as the idea of communities being unchanging and preserving beliefs without alteration through centuries or even longer does not make sense. As Georgina Boyce put it in her study of the British folk revivals, this idea that folk song and dance were actual unchanged survivals of earlier, long-standing traditions was necessarily based on a definition of the folk as manifesting a comprehensive absence of creativity. Unless, that is, the lack of change is exactly the point, because that unchanging form is the form that has power, which is where our folk horror narratives come in, because they tend to show that these old forms and beliefs, or the beliefs and forms that are presented as old, do have power, whether supernatural or as organizing society. What is important about this power is that it is essentially outside the dominant power structures of society. Yes, there is often a leader who is of higher social status and probably formal education, such as Lord Summerisle in The Wicker Man, Fisher in Robin Redbreast, Stephanie Bax in The Witches, Matthew Hopkins in Witchfinder General. Bax and Hopkins both come from outside the communities but find ways to tap into beliefs and desires through superstition and ritual to take over those communities. Indeed, in classic folk horror, it seems that there is little place for the power to originate from within the community itself, except potentially for in Blood on Satan's Claw, where the power of the demon is channeled through the community's youth, which is positioned against the formal authority of the judge, reverend, and doctor. This is one of the places where the incomers are important in representing not just a different worldview, but different social and power structures which are challenged by this community and its views. This is probably most obvious in The Wicker Man, with Howie as the servant of the crown and official representative of centralized authority. Boyce has pointed out that a revival is inherently both revolutionary and conservative. It simultaneously comprehends a demand for a change in an existing situation and a requirement of reversion to an older form. Through returning to the practices of the past, it is supposed to bring about a return to the past, not in terms of book knowledge, but in embodied experience and practice. To a certain extent, while these revivals in folk horror productions are often based on the recreation of practices based on the synthesis of book learning and research, particularly in The Wicker Man, Robin Redbreast, and very much so in The Witches. What is significant is that they receive embodiment. And in that embodiment, the people of the community find a connection, and so reconstruct the structures of feeling around the rituals and practices, and in doing so remake their meaning. The old ways, whether real or imagined, may not have the same meaning for the new community, but the community does imbue them with meaning and significance, and so power of the non-supernatural kind. This makes the appeal of the communities in folk horror one of belonging to something specific, local, not urban, national, or even international. Folk horror therefore challenges the idea of the national or wider identity. Whether imported, invented, or not, the rituals that bind together these communities carry meaning for them, suggesting that they have some connection to and present a way of communicating a sense of identity. These isolated communities can thus be understood as truer representatives of the culture, of the country, than anything put forward by metropolitan elites. This is obviously empowering for those who would align themselves with these common folk, while challenging those who may have more conventional economic, political, or cultural power. This idea of the folk as preserving true practices, even those as seemingly innocuous as songs and dances, also means that they stand against the homogenizing influences of globalization and the fear of becoming citizens of nowhere, specific place and culture. Obviously, this idea of the communities being potentially understood as representing some sort of true native culture opens up the possibility of reading them nationalistically or nativistically. Consider how these communities are typically depicted as homogenous. An obvious example being the Hurga of Midsummer, who do bring in outsiders, but it's the blonde and white ones who are used for their genetic material or accepted permanently, and no one else. This is no surprise when we remember that blood and soil is a Nazi slogan, as well as being common concepts in folk horror, including the way blood and soil intermingle. But we should also remember that the return to the land and to old ways of life has attracted those on the left as well as the right, and that's part of the tension that I think is important in folk horror, in that the way of living presented by the alternative society has many appealing aspects, but has a horrible cost associated with it. Howard David Ingham named his collection of essays on folk horror "We Don't Go Back," from a line in Nigel Neal's Murren, as representing a key principle of post-Enlightenment society that's challenged by folk horror and so defines the tensions in the genre. Science and post-Enlightenment thought tell us that we learn, we develop, move forward, but the past is comfortable and comforting, at least from the view of the complexity of the present, and so it appeals. This is what Svetlana Boym labelled restorative nostalgia, the claim that returning to the past can provide a cure for present ailments, whilst it's actually only a fantasy of an unattainable and probably imagined past. I've got to cut this very quickly. So folk horror can suggest that the dominant culture is rightly dominant because the alternative cultures end in death and horror. But it can also suggest that authority can be challenged and toppled by the power that is given to the folk. As Sergeant Howie suggests, at the next harvest failure, it will not just be the representative of central government who will be sacrificed, but it will be Lord Summerisle himself. I will skip other examples. So, what are we left with? Probably nothing that hasn't already been thought of by most people here. Folk horror, I argue, can be profitably examined through the role of the folk, because that helps us to think about how each text relates to conceptions of ordinary people working as a community. In doing so, it relates to images and ideas of identity, particularly national and local identity. And what many of the classic folk horror texts seem to present is a tension between the appeal of community and connection and the costs of going back to the past. We shouldn't go back, says folk horror, because the price is too much. But wouldn't it be awfully tempting to visit? Thank you.